On October 24th, 1929, a man named Joseph Kennedy stopped to get his shoes shined on his way to work. Now, Kennedy wasn't just anybody. He was one of the sharpest investors on Wall Street, a man who'd already made and lost fortunes, who understood markets better than almost anyone alive. And while the shoeshine boy worked on his shoes, the kid looked up and casually offered him a stock tip. Some railroad stock that was sure to go up. Kennedy didn't laugh. He didn't say thanks. He went pale. Because here's what went through his head in that exact moment. If a 12-year-old shining shoes for pocket change is confident enough to hand out stock tips, then who's left to buy? Everyone who could possibly get into this market is already in it. Grandmothers, elevator operators, shoeshine boys, which means there's nobody left to push prices any higher. There's only one direction left to go. Kennedy went straight to his office and sold everything. 9 days later, the American stock market lost more value in a single afternoon than had been created in its entire history up to that point. Fortunes that took decades to build vanished before dinner, and within 4 years, a quarter of the country would be out of work. This is the story of how the richest, most confident, most can't-lose economy on Earth tore itself apart in exactly 5 days. But it's not really a story about the past. It's a story about a feeling, the exact feeling investors get right before every single crash in history repeats itself. And by the end of this video, you'll probably recognize that feeling, because you've likely felt it yourself in the last few years without even realizing what it was. To understand how something like this happens, you have to understand what it felt like to be alive in America in the summer of 1929. The 1920s had been, by any measure, incredible. The war was over. Factories were humming. Cars, radios, refrigerators, things that had been luxuries a decade earlier were suddenly showing up in ordinary homes. Wages were rising. And for the first time in American history, regular working people started to hear a very seductive idea. You don't have to be rich to get rich. You just have to buy stock. And buying stock had never been easier. Brokerage offices opened on main streets in small towns that had never seen one before. Radio hosts talked about the market between songs. Barbers gave tips while they cut hair. It's estimated that by 1929, something like a third of all outstanding loans in America existed for one single purpose: buying stocks. Here's the thing that made it so dangerous, though. Most people weren't buying stocks with money they actually had. They were buying on margin. Buying on margin worked like this. You wanted $100 of stock, but you only needed to put down 10. Your broker would lend you the other 90. As long as the stock kept climbing, this was basically free money. You were investing with someone else's cash and keeping all the profit. Imagine a factory worker earning maybe $30 a week. He could walk into a brokerage with $100 of savings, put it down as margin, and suddenly control $1,000 of stock. If that stock rose 10%, he hadn't made 10%. He'd made 100%, doubled his money in weeks. Stories like that were everywhere. And when word travels that fast about money that easy, it stops being a rumor and starts being a religion. People mortgaged their homes to buy stock. Widows put in their life savings. It wasn't seen as gambling. It was seen as common sense, maybe even patriotic. America was the future, and betting against American business felt almost un-American. And the people who should have been the adults in the room, economists, bankers, government officials, mostly cheered it on. Just weeks before the crash, one of the most respected economists in the country stood in front of a crowd and confidently told them that stock prices had reached what looked like a permanently high plateau. In other words, don't worry, this is the new normal. It only goes up from here. If you've spent any time near financial markets in the last few years, that sentence should feel eerily familiar. By September of 1929, a handful of people quietly started noticing something was off. Industrial production, actual factories making actual things, had started slowing down that summer. Steel output was falling. Construction was cooling. In other words, the real economy underneath all this stock buying was starting to wobble, even while the stock prices themselves kept climbing like nothing was wrong. That's the part that should scare you a little. Stock prices and the real economy had quietly disconnected from each other. People weren't buying shares because a company was doing well. They were buying shares because the share price went up yesterday, and they assumed it would go up again tomorrow. A British economist visiting New York around this time was reportedly stunned by what he saw. Everyday people, with no financial background at all, speaking about the market with the swagger of professionals, treating stock picks like sports scores. On September 3, 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average hit its peak. Nobody rang a bell. Nobody announced it was over. It just quietly started drifting downward, day after day, while most people assumed it was a temporary dip, the kind of small pullback the market had shrugged off a dozen times before. They had no idea they were standing at the edge of a cliff, in the fog, still walking forward. 11 o'clock to 15:30. 5 days in October. By mid-October, the drift had turned into something uglier, and then came the week that would define the next decade of American life. Thursday, October 24th, later remembered as Black Thursday. Almost 13 million shares changed hands that day, nearly triple a normal trading volume, almost all of it people trying to sell. The trading floor descended into something close to chaos. Men shouting over each other, tickers running so far behind the actual trades that nobody in the building even knew the real prices anymore. Outside, a crowd gathered on Wall Street just watching, waiting to see what would happen next, the way people slow down to look at a car accident. A group of the country's most powerful bankers met that afternoon and pooled their own money to buy stock, publicly and visibly, trying to signal confidence back into the market. It worked for about 4 days. Monday, October 28th, Black Monday. The Dow fell nearly 13% in a single session. No rescue this time. The bankers' fund had run dry, and worse, people were starting to realize that even the people with the most money and the most information were scared too. Tuesday, October 29th, Black Tuesday. This was the big one. 16 million shares sold in a single day, a record that would stand for decades. The ticker tape fell so far behind that the closing bell rang and the machines kept clattering out prices from hours earlier into an empty, exhausted room. By the end of the day, the market had lost roughly $14 billion, an amount that, adjusted for today, would be somewhere north of $250 billion in one afternoon. Here's something worth pausing on, because Hollywood got this part wrong and the myth has stuck around for a century. There was not, in fact, a wave of stockbrokers leaping from windows across Manhattan. That image comes mostly from dark jokes that were circulating at the time, later repeated so often they got mistaken for documented fact. The real tragedy of the crash wasn't dramatic. It was slow, quiet, and it played out over years, not days. 1530 to 1830. What the crash actually cost. The stock market crash itself didn't cause the Great Depression, not directly, not by itself. What it did was expose just how much of the economy had been quietly built on borrowed confidence. Banks had lent out money for margin loans that were now worthless. When banks started failing, over 9,000 of them by the mid-1930s, ordinary people who had never touched a share of stock in their lives lost their entire life savings anyway, simply because their money happened to be sitting in the wrong bank. Factories that could no longer get loans laid off workers. Those workers stopped spending. The businesses they used to spend money at laid off more workers. It fed on itself for years. By 1933, roughly 1 in 4 working Americans had no job at all. Families who had owned homes were living in shanty towns built from scrap wood and tar paper, bitterly nicknamed Hoovervilles, after the president many blamed for the collapse. Bread lines stretched around entire city blocks. Farmers, unable to sell crops for enough to cover the cost of growing them, burned wheat for fuel instead of shipping it to cities where people were starving. The market itself wouldn't fully recover to its 1929 peak for another 25 years. 1830 to 2000. The part that still matters today. Here's why this story isn't really about 1929. Every generation seems to rediscover the exact same feeling. The conviction that this time, the rules are different. That this asset, this trend, this market has found a way to defy gravity permanently. It happened with tech stocks in 2000. It happened with housing in 2007. It's happened more than once with cryptocurrency. It happens every single time enough ordinary, smart, careful people convince themselves that everyone else getting rich around them must know something they don't. The uncomfortable truth is that the shoeshine boy is still out there. He just looks different now. Sometimes he's a stranger on social media, casually mentioning the return he made last month. Sometimes it's a coworker who won't stop talking about one stock at lunch. The feeling Joseph Kennedy had, that quiet, cold realization that maybe everyone's already in and there's nobody left to buy, that feeling is worth learning to recognize in yourself because it's the closest thing history has ever given us to an early warning system. Kennedy sold everything and kept his fortune. Most people didn't listen to that same instinct and lost everything they had. The market always survives. It always has. The only real question history keeps asking, over and over, generation after generation, is whether you'll be the one still holding on when the music actually stops.